Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today this is sort of something, I suppose, slightly different. I mean, it's still talking about books, but a few of you may have seen that the New York Times has put out a list recently of the top 100 books of the 21st century. And this is a bit of a range of translated and non-translated, of fiction and non-fiction. And it's an interesting list because I think it's always a fool's errand trying to pick the top 100 or top whatever books of any category is always going to be you're both sort of incredibly limited, but also not. There are so many books out there that how on earth are you ever going to compile them down? But I think this is quite an interesting list in many ways. Quite a lot more international books than I expected. A lot of these lists will naturally be sort of slightly more towards being a kind of particularly US list, given that it's the New York Times. But actually, apart from a few big name US authors who you'd probably expect to see there, it's fairly varied, actually. It's quite an interesting one. I just sort of want to talk about my thoughts on it. It's a list that's been put together as well by sort of submissions from authors and writers and kind of literary critics and all that kind of jazz. So in some ways it has that kind of backing of people within the industry and people who know this kind of thing somewhat well. And it's an interesting list in many ways. I think first sort of thoughts were that it felt quite US, and then I was thinking about that as I was going through and realised how many books from other countries also did feature on there. And, you know, some kind of ones that you might expect. So like Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald, and a few sort of, you know, some Elena Ferrante, books like that. But then also sort of ones like The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which I'm very excited to see in the list. But I didn't know how much of a splash that book had made outside of the UK, and obviously it won the International Booker, but it's always hard to judge with some of these things about what readership the books have had outside of this as well. And maybe it's helped by the fact that it's a lot of literary critics and writers, and therefore sort of it might pull on a few books that otherwise are sort of less commonly known. But quite interesting with all of them together to see what books have sort of ended up particularly high. Some books that I at first thought, I can't believe this book's not been included, and then realised it wasn't in the 21st century. And then other books that I'd almost forgotten had sort of just crept in. So books like Atonement by Ian McKellen, which were Ian McEwan even, very different, Ian McEwan. That was 2001. And so that's, you know, right at the early bit of this. Also interesting to see books like Detransition Baby that are only a couple of years old make it into the list as well. So even books from just the last few years have managed to enter into there. So that was my first key thought. I don't want to spoil the book that's number one, so maybe look away. It's not that big a spoiler in the sense of it's fairly easy to access, although you do normally have to create a login account. But that book being Elena Ferrante's sort of first of the quartet. And it's an interesting one. I don't get me wrong, I really like the quartet. I really like the series. I don't know if I'd have had it as the top book. I actually think something like Atonement would maybe have been right up in the top 5 at least there for me. A few people have pointed out other kind of books not being there that seem a bit strange given the kind of popularity they've enjoyed. So books like A Little Life not making the top 100. So it's quite a varied and interesting list. I will also say I'm delighted to see Kise Lamon's Heavy in this. The kind of fun thing with it being fiction and non-fiction is you get books like that. And I think Heavy by Kise Lamon is probably one of the most incredible things I've read in the last few years. Nothing really has hit me quite as hard as that book. It's a memoir where he talks, he really examines his relationship with him, both between himself and his mother, but also between between himself and his body, particularly around weight, hence sort of the title of the book as well, and how it's sort of intertwined with how he feels about himself. It's so beautifully done, and there are scenes towards the end of that book that really stick with me. So yeah, a really interesting list in many ways. There's also a function where you can tag along as you go, sort of the books you've read. And I'm going to quickly pull it up just to make sure I've got the exact number. Yeah, so I've apparently read 44 of the 100, which is fun. And a lot of the books that I've not read are pretty much ones I've been wanting to read. So that's nice. That's always encouraging. I'm trying to resist the urge to turn this into another project of, now let's read the other 56 books. I will probably end up reading the other 56 books at some point in my life. That doesn't have to be in the next 6 months. But they are some really cracking books. I think the inclusion of non-fiction in this list actually makes a lot of sense. Because you've got a lot of books in here. So Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, being a really good example of a book that has been such an influential piece of non-fiction writing. The same for something like The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. Those are such influential books. And it's hard to think of kind of the 21st century and sort of writing without books like that have even influenced, I think, a lot of novels and a lot of authors of mostly fiction as well. So really interesting. I'd recommend, if it sounds interesting to you, that you have a look at the list and see what takes your fancy. Some really great books in here. And even if it obviously has more of a US bent, I think there are still some fantastic books included. I'd have loved to have seen something like The Life of Pi on here. And I get that for some people, I don't know, I just love that book. I just think it's great. I would have loved to see Milkman by Anna Burns. The Booker does help, it turns out, in terms of having read a lot of these, because quite a few Booker winners or kind of shortlisted books from the Booker appear in this list. And with my Booker hat on, very glad to see it. Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, they're both on this list. A few other former winners, Paul Beatty's The Sellout. Books like The Underground Railroad that was longlisted, quite a few books. It's very Pulitzer-heavy as well, actually, as a list. Quite a lot of Pulitzer winners. Trust by Hernan Diaz, I think, is in it. Demon Copperhead is in this. So you've got a lot of the kind of big hitters, and particularly Pulitzer winners appearing in this. But yes, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts once you've had a little look at the list. Are there books that you think should have been in this or should have been higher? Would love to hear your thoughts. Either way, I hope you're keeping really well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.